In this lecture, we're going to be talking about lighting and introducing you guys to common concepts for becoming a lighter in VFX and animation, and what you need to keep in mind when you are doing your lighting for your short films. When we're lighting for animation, there are three principles that we need to keep in mind at all times to be successful in lighting our shots. These three things are we want to use our lighting to tell a story, we want to use our lighting to direct the eye in the image, and we also want to use lighting to define form and shape. So let's start with telling a story. Lighting can be used to pull us in a particular narrative direction, like in this shot from Toy Story 3. As Buzz is approaching this vending machine, those lights are giving us a clear direction and relationship between these characters. Lighting is often used to set the tone and mood for a particular sequence, and that is done by changing a lot of different properties of the lights, including the direction of the lights, the colors of the lights, the number of lights, how deep and dark those shadows are. They all contribute to giving a particular emotion to a different shot. So you can see same sort of characters in these shots, maybe shot a little bit differently in framing, but generally the biggest difference is just where the light is, the color of the light is, how much there is of it, and where it's coming from. So in this case on the left hand side, we're getting a lot of bouncy ambient light, so lights just kind of bouncing around, picking up all these warm, friendly colors. It's our primary light source is a natural sunlight kind of light source, so it has a very open, warm, and friendly atmosphere. Whereas the one on the right, we have our primary lighting source is coming in at a more harsh angle from the side. It is this red color, and so this weird kind of aggressive color of the light source is adding tension to the shot as well. And generally speaking, there's also less light than there is in this shot. So it feels a little bit less inviting and has more of a menacing or dark feel to it. A lot of times you can squint at the frame and you can get a sense of what the emotion is in that moment just from seeing the color and the direction and the overall tone of the lights. So you can see from this one we have some pretty desaturated lighting. It's on the cooler end. The whole thing feels a bit gray. All of the colors are kind of muted, and it's also coming from the side, so it has a little bit of a drama to it. And it makes sense for the shot, right? Because it's supposed to be a sad or low moment, right? So it has kind of like a somber or death-like feeling to it, just in terms of just the color and the directionality of the lighting. It also feels kind of gentle at the same time. Compared to this part right here, the lighting feels very warm and jubilant. We have a lot of fun colors going around. We have this nice blue to a warm contrast, so it feels kind of engaging. And so this feels overall pretty pleasant, right? Which makes sense for this shot, right? It's not very dramatic. It's pretty safe, friendly, and enjoyable. Lighting can give us great first impressions. Similar to when establishing the mood, lighting can be used to describe a character or introduce a character in a particular way. So in this example here, on the left-hand side, we have the Godfather, and lighting is being used to give him a very sinister look, right? His eyes are in shadow. There's more of his skull is emphasized with his shadow because of the hard light, and so it feels menacing. The one on the right with Gandalf, right? Lighting is very gentle and soft. We see everything evenly lit. It's very pleasant and warm. And so he feels very welcoming, and we feel safe looking at these characters. Here's Aragorn, right, in two different movies, right? The first movie, when we were first introduced to him, it's similar to The Godfather, right? We're not seeing his eyes. He's in shadow. And so lighting is being used to give him a dangerous look to him. He looks like someone who can't be trusted. Whereas by the end of the series, he's shown as kingly and heroic and strong. And so he has this very generous, soft, heroic lighting to him. Another aspect of using lighting to tell a story is indicating the time, place, and weather of our film. So in this example here, you can tell that the direction of the lighting, the color of the lighting, and what the light sources are is really indicating to us a lot of information about our space and where we are and what time it is. So on the left-hand side, the primary light source is this really intense warm light coming from outside, so you feel like it's pretty early in the day, or maybe it's getting close to noon, and it's not overcast, it's a clear skies, right? And the main lighting source is coming from outside. On the right-hand side, the light that's coming from outside is very cool, almost like a blue-purple color, and it's not as intense, so it feels like it's coming from the moon. And we also have these much stronger interior light sources that are kind of overpowering that outside lighting, which clearly indicates to us this is nighttime. In these two examples, color is going a long way to indicating a particular time of day. So on the left-hand side, they're really exaggerating that kind of bluish tint that you might get from light reflected off of the moon. And so they're pushing it a little bit further to make it feel like movie nighttime. And on the right-hand side, we again have this really warm, strong directional lighting from the sun, and it's also kind of dried up a bit, right? So a lot of the colors are a little desaturated, which gives it a little bit of a dryness, like you're in the desert. Here's a great example showing how before lighting, we don't really get a great indication of what time of day it is, but on the right-hand side, you can clearly see this night setting where the primary light source isn't coming from the sky, and we are also getting those cooler night colors. Let's move on to talking about directing the eye. So lighting is really important for keeping us focused on what's important in the scene and drawing the viewer's eye to what you want them to look at. So this example from Up, on the left-hand side, you can see before lighting, the whole image is very confusing and difficult to look at. We have clear color distinction and contrast in these characters, but this space feels very flat. It's kind of hard to tell the depth of the space. And on the right-hand side, you can see they're using this lighting to shape where we're supposed to be looking, right? It's pulling back or dying down or dimming down this background element here, and you can see Carl is clearly silhouetted against this dark shape behind him, helping us pull our attention to what's important right here. This example from Ratatouille, right? We're using light coming in from outside to kind of give him a heroic aura, but we're also using it to direct our attention just to this area right here. Similar to that Up example, before we add that lighting, everything is given the same importance through lighting, and once we apply the lights, you'll see that the lighting is clearly pulling us into the center area and framing this character and having us focus on them. This is a great example from WALL-E where this is a very complex and cluttered scene, and nothing really has a distinct hierarchy to it. Nothing has emphasis or importance put on it. But through lighting, right, by adding like atmosphere to drop down the contrast, getting the strong rim light so WALL-E pops off, right, we can get a clear focus on who we're supposed to be looking at despite the complexity of this shot. So value is one of the most important elements that we can work with when we are trying to direct the viewer's attention with lighting. So value is the relative lightness or darkness in the scene, right? Whether something is in shadow or something is brightly lit. Contrast creates the most powerful impact or the most draw to the viewer's eye. So any area that has a sharp change between a dark value to a light value is going to have a lot of visual importance. Areas that don't have a sharp increase or change in value are not going to be very interesting, or things we're not going to be really wanting to look at. So this example here, we have these areas right in the background that are relatively low contrast, right? There's not big dynamic shifts in value. They kind of fall off into the background and we don't focus on them. And then these areas that are very high contrast and there's a lot of value changes going on draw our attention. There's other elements to it, of course, including recognizing the shape of a person and the eye, which draws a lot of attention. But generally speaking, it's the really darks versus the brights right here, and those sharp changes in values back here that are drawing our attention. Value can be used to separate space and describe space in a way that we separate the foreground, middle ground, and background from each other, and add depth to our scene. And also by defining or simplifying space, we can more easily simplify our scene visually so the viewer can focus on what's important. And we'll take a look at a few of those examples. So the easiest way you can think about this is if you grouped or simplified an area of the frame into a value region, and if you group different areas with different values, they start to separate away from each other. And so you can see here, there's like a city, background, and a character. As long as they're all three of them different values, they separate, and it's easy for us to visually understand the space and separate, the character from the background, for instance. One of my favorite examples to show for this is the artist Gustave Doré. And so in his, I think they're woodcut prints, they might be something else, he has these clear separations of value space. And so he groups different areas into a more simplified value region so that the space is easier to understand because we're separating the background from the midground from the foreground. And so these two characters in the foreground are a different color or value than these guys right here. And we even have this dark shape to help accentuate and make these guys pop out. Because if they were against this background right here, they wouldn't stand out quite as much. And so it adds a little bit more contrast here as well, which is nice for directing our eye to this area. Here's an example from How to Train Your Dragon 2, and this is a great example because this is a relatively complex looking environment. There's a lot of texture, there's a lot of shapes going on, but it's been organized in a way to make it simplified so that we can separate characters and space through value. So if we block this down to black and white, we can see that the relative contrast behind these characters is pretty low, right, compared to the contrast on the character themselves. So Stoic, he has these really sharp value changes from his skin and these shiny metal bits versus his dark fur, and he has all these details. And if you look at this background, especially if you squint at it, you get a sense that this isn't really jumping in value very much, and there's not a whole lot of contrast back here. Same thing with his wife, Hiccup's mother, I don't remember what her name is. The area behind her, even though it has a lot of texture and detail, is fairly low contrast, right? You're not jumping between values a lot. But she's jumping between value a lot. Very dark values versus very light values. And this is also a good demonstration of the term light over dark or dark over light, which is a great way of making something separate in your frame or your composition, particularly characters. So in this case, Stoic is light over dark, so he's primarily a light figure and over a dark background, and so he separates and it draws our attention over here as well. And then the mother is dark over light, so it's a light background and she's a dark figure, and so she separates really well too. And so even though this is a pretty complex scene, our eyes know immediately what to look at because of the relative value contrast and that separation of value or space through value. Here's a pretty extreme example of that dark over light or light over dark concept. And so here we can see the characters' heads are clearly silhouetted against these value fields. That really defines their shape, and we can really understand who they are and what they look like, and it's easy to follow them. We lose them a little bit on the left-hand side, which is okay. What's more important is his face is isolated against that background and clearly defined by that dark over light. In this example here, we have this separation of this space right here from these soldiers. If this was shot a different way or framed a different way, this figure would be over this really busy background, and the actor would be hard to look at, right? It'd be hard to isolate them and pull them out of the background. But by having this big, simplified, low contrast value field behind him, he clearly separates, and we know to focus on him. It's easy to read his character. So we can use lighting and value to move our eye through the frame and create focal points and to direct us to what's important. On the left-hand side, you can see how the light is cutting and highlighting and revealing these figures as it travels through the scene, right? Directing us to an important narrative element as she's describing the history of their people-making organization. On the right-hand side, from another example from How to Train Your Dragon 2, we're using light to keep us focused on the expressive area of Stoic's face, right? He's having this really important conversation with Stoic, and so we're keeping that really, really strong, almost, again, another spotlight on his face, because that's what we want to focus on. And you can even see there's a bit of a bounce light coming off of his face, emphasizing and separating Hiccup's face from the background, which otherwise it would just be really dark and we wouldn't even notice Hiccup really. We would just be focusing 100% on Stoic. And you can also see, again, value in space, how they're using this lighter shape or this lighter area to separate out the helmet from the background. The third fundamental use of lighting is to define form and shape. In order to shape our figures, we need to start talking about different types of light sources. And these are the different terms we use to describe lights based on their purpose and where they are. So the first light that we want to talk about is probably the most important one, and that is the key light. The key light you can think of as your primary lighting source. This is the light that's going to be doing most of your illumination in your shot, and it, more importantly, it also describes the form of your object through light shapes and shadow shapes. And so it's going to be used to shape and sculpt your figure with light. Okay, so here's an example from No Country for Old Men. So we have this key light coming from the right-hand side, and we're revealing and shaping this character from this light source right here. And again, jumping back to that idea of value in space, using light over dark and dark over light, right? You have his light side over dark background and his dark side over light background to help pop him out. Here we have a light source that's off camera, and it's not always the case, but many times the key light is going to be off camera. It's going to be something you can't see, which gives you a lot of flexibility as a director of photography, or if you're doing this in the computer in a program like Maya, gives you a lot of flexibility to set up and position your light however you want to without it really needing to make full sense. But again, that light source that's off camera, and we can kind of see a reflection of it in his eyes. It might be a window, but most likely it's a giant softbox light. That's the primary lighting source. It's what's creating the light side and the shadow side on him. There's other lights in the scene, right? But again, the key light is the one that's doing that primary lighting structure and shadow structure on our subject, which is revealing the shape and forms of their face or whatever it is that you're lighting. Here's an example from Fight Club. We, again, have a key light that's off camera, but we also have a lot of context in the scene which could indicate what that light source could be, right? So we see this light right here, even though that's not the light source, right, because it's behind him. We get a sense that this is some kind of artificial street light or light in the parking lot that might be lighting the character, even though in reality it's not going to be one of those light sources. And its position also doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But the main idea is we just want the lighting to shape the character nicely and still be believable, right? As an audience, we get the idea of, okay, it's probably, a light source that's just off here. And you don't think about it that much, as long as it's relatively believable. But this light source is actually coming more from the side. But we're, again, getting a strong light side and a strong shadow side, and we're getting a lot of shape information in his face from the lighting. And again, that's what we're talking about right now with choosing our lighting and placing it, is it's about shaping the character. Here's just one more example from one of the Lord of the Rings movies. Again, you can see the reflection of the light sources. There's actually two of them, right? So it might be like a main key light source and a little supportive light source as well to just kind of add a little fill. And again, it's not really physically plausible, right? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because it looks like there's a giant light source that's like at waist height in the space. And in the scene, there's not like a light source that's probably there. But you get a sense that it could be a window that might be letting light in, or it could be maybe be a fireplace in this situation. I'm not sure in the context of the scene. But again, this light source is coming in a little bit from the side, and again, we're getting a strong light side and a shadow side. Compared to that Fight Club example, that light source and this one from the pianist, you see how that light source, that key light, is coming from different angles in all three of these. And it really adds a different tone or mood to the shot, right? The one that's from the side, it feels a little bit more sinister and a little bit more mysterious. And when it's coming straight from the front, it feels a little bit more pleasant and comfortable. One other way you could describe key lights is through these terms called far side and near side. And what that has to do with is whether that light source is near the camera or on the opposite side of the character. So if we're focusing on this subject right here, and that key light source is on the same side as that character's, you can kind of draw a line from their nose, right? And if you, the camera, and the viewer, and the light source are on the same side of that line from the nose, that's called the near side key. If the light source is on the opposite side of their nose, or coming from the opposite direction than the camera or the viewer, then that's called a far side key. And generally speaking, there's not that much reason you guys might be choosing one or the other until you get more experience, but far side key is definitely a very common cinematic look. It adds, so you'll have the shadow on the camera side and the light side will be on the opposite side of the character, kind of like this, both of these shots right here, right? We're on the left-hand side of his nose, but the light source is on the right-hand side of his nose. It's a very cinematic look. But that doesn't mean it's always the best choice. But that's something you might hear is a short side or near side, or sorry, far side or near side. There's another term for it, which is short side and broad side. But I think these make a little bit more sense. So here you can see this would be a near side, right? Because the light source is on the side of the camera, right? And then far side, if we had a key light coming from the other side, like we do right here, same actress, right? That key light is on the opposite side of her nose, and that's a far side key light. And this would be another example of a broad key or near side. And then there's another example of a far side key light, again on the opposite side of his nose than the camera is. We're on his right hand side, the key light's on his left hand side. Our key light can come from really any different direction. Remember, the key light is that primary lighting source that's illuminating our scene. But there's a couple directions that are very common and create an appealing lighting structure on your subject. And the one that I personally use a lot, and that's kind of pretty standard for a good portion of your lighting scenarios, is kind of a 45-degree Rembrandt lighting situation. This is where the key light is to the side and slightly above the character, pointing down at them. And it's good for creating a really nice light and shadow structure in your face. If you look at all of these examples I've shown before, if they're not a 45-degree Rembrandt lighting scenario, they're not that far off, right? They're all slightly to the side. None of them are right behind the camera. None of them are coming straight from the side, right? They're always kind of in that 45-degree zone, slightly to the side and maybe slightly above. But again, that's not standard. That's not all scenarios, but it's a very common lighting structure. And it's called the Rembrandt lighting because it was popularized by the Renaissance painter Rembrandt, who had this popularized this lighting structure where the primary lighting source that's shaping the subject is to the side and slightly above. And there's also this thing called the Rembrandt triangle. And so that's that triangle of light on the shadow side that's created at that angle from the nose and the cheek. And again, that's not something that's at all necessary for you to do this, but it's a common thing that people try to get to make appealing light structure on the face. And remember, we're talking about lighting structure and right shaping our characters with light. And this is really popular and really common because that angle is a really good angle for getting a nice shadow and light shape on the face. Here's an example I quickly mocked up. I didn't find really any good comparison example, so I just did this in RenderMan really quickly. So when we have light that's coming straight from the front, or sometimes even straight from the side, side's okay, but mostly frontal lighting is what you want to avoid. And you don't. So what that means is the light source is directly behind the camera and coming from the same direction and same point of view as the camera. And look at the comparison between these and ask yourself which one of these looks more appealing. This one right here is, might be subjectively unappealing, but one of the main issues with this light source is that it flattens the subject out a lot. Because it's coming directly from the camera, we're not getting really a great shadow and light shaping to the face, so I can clearly understand the forms. I can get a sense of it for the most part, but because it's coming directly from the camera, a lot of this shape kind of flattens out, and it just looks a little bit boring. But when it's coming a little bit more from the side, so this is kind of like a Rembrandt 45, so it's to the left and up higher, right? And so we have a clear light and shadow side. So look at those lips, like see how the lips now have a light and shadow side. We can understand their volume and form better. The forehead, right, we're getting some clear shaping on it as well. I also added a little backlight, kick light that's maybe cheating a little, or helping out a little bit. But for the most part, this is what we talk about. This is what we mean with our lighting, using our key light to shape and sculpt our character or our subject. Is we're trying to use the lighting to create an appealing light and shadow forms. And here's a great demonstration. If you looked at it from above, right, here's our camera source, here's our subject. And so instead of that light being down here, right behind the camera, it's over to the side a little bit. And that 45-degree angle is a very safe zone for making appealing lighting and sculpting. Again, it's not always the right choice for the moment, right? If you're trying to go for something that's more moody or dramatic or dark, you might want to go for that, Fight Club example, right, where you're getting the side lighting, or something from The Godfather. I had another example from that that you'll see in a little bit. But the key light, that 45-degree angle, the main idea is we just don't want it to be right behind the camera. Side lighting would be if your key light was coming at the subject from the side. This creates a very dramatic look because a lot of our, we make this really, really large, broad shadow area on the face. And a lot of the film, usually, or a lot of the subject, usually in this situation, goes into shadow, which adds a lot of mystery or drama or suspense because we can't see what's in there, and things look more mysterious. If you see someone's eyes, cast in shadow, then they look like they're mysterious or dangerous. You could also call this chiaroscuro lighting because of the drastic contrast between the light and the shadow. And so from both of these examples, our primary light source is coming much more from the side. So the key light is our light source that's going to be doing our primary shaping and sculpting of our subject. And the fill light is the lights that we add in so that we don't have such a dramatic or harsh look, right? You might not want it to look like, The Godfather, right? You're not trying to get your scene to feel really dark or moody. You just want some nice shaping on your character, but you still want them to be well lit or well illuminated. So the fill light is any light source that's being used to kind of lighten up any of the shadow areas. So the majority of lighting structures in most films are going to have a key light and then also one or two fill lights just to kind of fill in the shadow area so it's not quite so dramatic and harsh, right? So you can see in these examples, a light source is being put in a position where it's just adding extra little light or fill into these shadow sides to lighten the subject back up. But even on this one, even though this fill light's really bright, you're still, from that key light, we're still getting a really strong light side, right, and shadow side, which again, we're getting a really nice lighting structure on our subject. Same thing with this one. This one's much more, that fill light is much more less noticeable, and so even though it's only gently adding in, it's really revealing a lot of this information, and it feels a lot less dramatic than this one right here. You can describe fill light and a key light relationship as a lighting ratio, and this is the idea that that intensity between the key light's brightness or that difference between key light and fill light's brightness is represented by a ratio. And when they're the same, when both the key light and the fill light are the exact same, then you have a 1-to-1 lighting ratio. And then of course, as that difference changes, we get a larger ratio or proportion or fraction or whatever you want to call it, with the key light being higher and the fill light being lower. The rim light is going to be an extra little sculpting light that's common in a lot of lighting structures to help with that idea of separation from the background, and also with sculpting areas that are cast into shadow. And so this is a light source that's coming from behind the subject and is hitting them at a grazing angle. And so you can see on this example from Schindler's List, right, this right here, this light that's coming and hitting the back of his cheek and his ears and his hair, and even this little bit right here, and even a little bit of his coat right there, that's a rim light. So this is really helpful for making that area pop a little bit, especially if it feels like it's blending into the background. And also, we'll see in some examples, like on this example from Moonlight, we have this light that's coming. It's really, this would be just completely cast into shadow without that light coming from outside in that direction. But it's revealing a lot of the form, and so it's shaping his head, his ear, and his neck really nicely. So it's also adding a lot to the sculpting or the form or the shaping of our subject. In this case, the key light is also kind of, well, I guess you could argue if there's like a frontal light that's hitting right here that's really soft, There's also another rim light that's coming to the side. That frontal light, you could argue, would be the key light, or this rim light that's coming from the left-hand side on his face, you could also argue as being a key light as well. But that's a rim light. It's a light that's coming from the side or back. It's more from the back that's going to be outlining or adding a little extra shaping to your character. So this example from Blade Runner, we have this right here. This is a rim light right along here that's just shaping his jacket really nicely, revealing a lot of shape and form, also making his hair and head pop out from the background and separate. You're also getting a little bit of it right here as well, again helping with separation. You're also getting a nice rim light right there on his knuckles. It's the same light that's hitting here most likely. But again, even though this is blurred out, if you didn't have that, his hand would be kind of like a blurry blob that you wouldn't really notice, but that rim light pops his knuckles, and so you can read his hand even though it's out of focus, which is pretty cool. Here's an example from Ratatouille. Lots of rim lights going on here. We have rim lights on these characters to kind of help them pop a little bit from the background. We have this really strong rim light on Ego's shoulders and his hair. It adds a little bit extra dimensionality. It just makes it look a little bit nicer as well. But again, it's also to help separate from the background and also add a little extra shaping and form to it. And Linguini has a lot of kind of rim lighting going on his hair, just to kind of help. Again, like if look at the value of this right here and the value right here, they're pretty similar, but this just adds a little extra contrast that separates the character. In this example, the rim light doesn't make, a lot of times you'll see rim lights, they don't make a whole lot of sense. And it's the same idea, we'll talk about it later, but this idea of believability over realism. So you want something to just feel believable and feel good. You don't want to add a light that feels completely alien and foreign and doesn't make sense, but you want the light sources to or you can have the light sources be, as long as they're believable and feel like they could work in the context of the scene, the viewer isn't going to question it too much, even if it doesn't actually make that much sense. So in this case, we have rim light. This is kind of like the primary lighting source is this rim light, or this really strong backlight that's hitting these characters, right? And it kind of wraps all the way around them. You see on her, you have this really, really strong blown out light right here. It's also wrapping around to the front of her face and onto her torso, and same thing with his, on his back and his torso. And like there would have to be a light source right here and a light source right here just to do that. But if you think about the context of the scene, where in the world would that be? There's light sources, 2 lights right there. That doesn't make sense. But it creates this really interesting lighting setup on these characters, and then this is another example similar to the Moonlight example, where the rim lighting or the backlighting is kind of the primary sculpting and illumination source in the scene. We do have a little bit of a fill that's popping in right here and filling in their face, because otherwise this would be a little too far into shadow and we want to see their faces. But the primary lighting source is that rim or backlighting. Here's another example from Blade Runner, and you'll hear different terms, and this is where I might have mentioned earlier, where different lights kind of blend into each other, like in terms of categorization. So in this case, again, our key light's kind of coming from the front, right? It's this frontal soft light that's hitting right here, but you could also, again, argue that it might be this side light that's hitting her face, right? This primary lighting structure light source. But either way, there's different terms for these lights, so it's very easy for a rim light or a backlight to kind of blend in and become like a side light. Another term you'll hear for it is a kick light, and that's just like a light that's not the primary lighting source, but is kind of like a rim light where it's adding extra shaping and dimensionality to the subject. And so again, the key light in this case, even though the side light or backlight or kick light is definitely the most intense light source in the scene, the primary lighting structure on her face is coming from the front, and so I would consider that the key light. There's a little bit of soft, like ambient fill just kind of getting into here, and then we have this extra shaping on her temple and her jaw cheekbone from this side kick backlight. Another term we might use for describing different light sources, this is less about an actual light that you would be placing in like a real life film. Well, you would use something to create it, but really this is trying to mimic a natural phenomenon, and this is what natural fill light looks like, is the idea of bounce or indirect light. And this is light that bounces off of other surfaces and then hits the subject. So it's not necessarily coming from a light source, it's actually bouncing off of something else and then hitting it. And our entire world, is made up of bounce light and indirect light, right? You look in your room, if you don't have, the sun blazing into your room and you have your lights off during the day, right? Your room's still bright, and that's all bounce and indirect light. That's light that's bouncing from outside or bouncing from another space into your room, and it's bouncing around and gathering around, and you're getting this extra ambient, indirect, or fill light. So when we're lighting our subject, if we're using like a physically based renderer or a path tracer renderer, we're going to naturally get indirect or bounce light, right? We're going to be calculating light bouncing around the scene. But a lot of times, if you want to push it a little bit, and especially if you're working in something that doesn't have a very robust like ambient light, indirect light calculator, or way of calculating that stuff, you want to kind of add extra little bounces. And sometimes what people will do is, just like in real life, you'll have something called a reflector, which is like a little reflective light source, or not light source, a little reflective disc that's right off camera, and it bounces light from the key light back into the person's face just to kind of fill them up. And you'll see that a lot in movies where if a character has like this really generous fill ambient light that's bouncing into their face, it's usually from some kind of reflective light source, if not a reflective surface, if not an actual light source, to bounce some light into there and just brighten it up a little bit and get some natural fill. And you'll see in this example on the left-hand side, great example from a painting. I just like showing paintings if I can. A lot of these colors that are happening from right here, you see how even this is the key light coming from this direction. And even though these are the shadow sides, we're getting a lot of light bleeding into these areas. And that's because light's hitting this surface here and then bouncing in there. Or light's hitting this surface here and bouncing right there. And so that's that natural bounce or indirect light. And on this example, right, where again the primary lighting source is probably this backlight, this kind of rim light that's really shaping them really nicely. Like look at how well it's like kind of like outlining them. Which is debatable if you want to actually do that. You don't want to silhouette your characters perfectly. But and then the light's also bouncing off of, theoretically, like a surface down here and then bouncing into their faces, even though in real life we're actually using like reflectors to bounce up into the characters' faces. Natural or available light would be describing light that comes from the real world. And so this is where you're not actually setting up a light source or a local light source, but you're working with the available light that exists in the world. And so this is very common in if you're going to be shooting outdoors, right? You would still use some lights and supportive stuff, but you're really relying and working with what nature is providing in terms of like the weather of that day, what time of day it is, where the sun's at, if it's overcast. You guys don't really have to worry about this, of course, because you guys have to create your light sources in your 3D package. But generally speaking, this is what natural or available light means. Practical or motivated lights would be the light sources that are actually in the scene that you could use to indicate that or motivate what the primary lighting structure in your scene is. So in this case, on the left-hand side from I think Goodfellas, you have all this lighting in the restaurant, and we even have these like desk lights, or not these desk lights, these table lights that might be lighting the characters. But again, in reality, when they're lighting this, they're using standing lights and art-directed lights to light these characters instead of just relying on the light sources that just happen to be in the restaurant, because that's hard to control. But that idea of having a light source that's motivating or giving the impression that that's where the primary light source is coming from, that's what practical or motivated light is. So it adds believability to your lighting choices. And you can also, a lot of times you can use them to enhance or drive your lighting in the shot. But most of the time it's also off-screen and faked, the actual light. So here's this example right here. This would be a motivated or practical light source. So a light source that's actually seen in the scene and doing the primary lighting on these characters. And here's another example. Again, there's usually going to be some supplementary light sources off camera that are going to help out a little bit, and they're not going to rely just on that because it's a little tough to do that. A lot of times these lights are very fake or not really realistic, but again, we're going for believability. So in reality, unless, look at him compared to her. Why is she's like smack dab in the middle screen? She would show up on the actual screen of the movie theater because she's like blocking the light. But that doesn't really matter. We're not thinking about that. They're using this light source that exists in the space to accentuate the moment. Like it looks like she's having like a revelation, or it almost acts like a halo, like she's holy or something like that. So this would be a motivated light source where, again, we're using lights that exist in the space to create an effect or kind of add to the moment, enhance the moment, but isn't really believable or realistic. And this example here too, right? This light source that's coming or lighting up this fog feels like it's coming from that window, but it doesn't really make much sense. That'd have to be a really strong light to do that. But it creates this really cool shape and adds this story context where we're drawing connection between the character and that window. Here we can see a light source that's most likely the TV. I think it's Poltergeist, but I might be wrong. So we have this off-camera light source. Again, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Whatever that light source is, it shouldn't be that bright unless it's just an exposed bulb on the ground. But it kind of makes sense. It's believable, and it's also creating these really interesting effects in the shot, like this really big, oversized shadow that he's casting onto the wall that's kind of dominating the scene. Catchlight refers to the light that is being caught in the eyes of your subject. Usually this is one of your primary lighting sources, so like your key light or your fill light, but it can also be used to put a light or a reflected light in a very particular spot in the eyes because you feel like it's more appealing, especially if you're working in computer graphics or animation where you have a lot more control of moving those lights around without actually changing the light that much. You can kind of fake a different shape in the catch light. But what it does is that light, seeing that light in somebody's eyes adds a lot of life to the eyes. Without it, it starts to feel a little bit dead. So you can see in this example from Saving Private Ryan, someone removed the catch light in Tom Hanks's eyes, and you can see when they put it back in, it makes his eyes look much more alive. And in reality, you don't always have catch light in your eyes. There's going to be parts where you're just naturally not going to get a large, bright, reflected light source in your eyes. But it tends to make things look a little less appealing. And that shape of it is really based on the shape of your light sources, right? So you can see, you can have a complicated reflection of like a window or, a bright environment, or it could be just like a really strong direct light source. Like in this case, it's a strobe or the sun or a lamp in your room, or it could be just something that's really big, broad, and soft. And this is really popular in cartoons and, animated films. And so you'll see this in all these examples. The catch light is kind of a put in, even though doesn't always make sense. But it's added to add a little extra appeal and interest to the character's eyes and just make them look a little bit more alive. There's two other terms I'm going to cover in terms of describing our lights, and that is hard lighting and soft lighting. And this refers to the quality of our light that affects shadows. And so a hard light is going to be where the shadows are really sharp, really crisp, really hard, high contrast. A soft light is going to be where the shadows cast from that light source are very diffuse and feathered and soft and gentle, and just has a much softer look to it. So there's two things that primarily affect whether the shadow quality of your light source. One is going to be the distance of the light source, and two is going to be the size of the light source. And you can combine those together into just the idea that it's the size of the light source relative to the subject is going to change how sharp or soft those shadows are. So if a light source is the same light source but farther away, it's going to look smaller, or it's going to be smaller relative to your subject, right? It's going to be a smaller light source. So the sun, for instance, is a really small light source, even though in reality it's a huge light source. But because it's so far away from us, it appears to us as a really small, tiny light source. And so the smaller your light source is, the harsher or sharper your shadows are going to be, and the larger your light source is, the softer your shadows are going to be. And so that's, like I said, that same idea. If I have the same size light source, if I have it closer, it's going to look like a larger light source. It's going to be a larger light source relative to the subject, and you're going to get softer shadows. Take that same light source and move it back away from the subject. It's going to appear smaller to the subject, and it's going to make harder shadows. So here's an example. We can look at that catch light in the character's eyes. to get a sense of what the primary light source looks like in the scene, just seeing the reflections in his eyes. So we can see that this side over here, that primary lighting source is a really, really soft, a pretty large light source. So we're getting these really soft shadows. You're not really getting a sharp shadow shape on his nose or anywhere else. On the left-hand side, we have a really small light source, and you can see it's creating these really sharp, high contrast shadow shapes on his face. Here's another example, right? Really small light source relative to the subject. It can be the same light, it's just at different distances, but the main idea is this light source is smaller relative to the subject. We're getting really sharp shadows. And then on the right-hand side, we have a larger light source and we get soft shadows. You can see in this case, a lot of times, especially if you're talking about like headshots and beauty photography, you're going to use really soft lighting, so larger light sources, but that's not always the best, right? So in this example, this is a really great example of how that still looks really attractive and appealing, that hard light source, that really small light source. It just creates a more dramatic and tense atmosphere to the image, whereas the one on the right-hand side feels much more gentle and appealing and calm. But it's just that quality of those shadows is adding a lot of weight to that idea or that emotion of your lighting. Here we can see an example where they're using kind of the same fill light but different key lights. So in this one they have a hard light, so again it's a small light source or it's far away. So you're getting these really deep dark shadows, really sharp shadow shapes on his like eye sockets, his nose, his mouth. And then when you put it together with the fill light helps, but you can still see these kind of like jarring sharp shadow shapes that are showing up on his face, right? And so on this one right here, we've added using a soft key light, and so those shadow shapes are blurred out. And then we add that fill light in, we get this more gentle and even lighting. So compare these two together, right? This one, the shadows from his eye sockets and his nose aren't quite as noticeable, whereas in here, even with the fill light, those shapes are still kind of being drawn on the face. And here's just one more example, right? Showing this is the same distance, right? So this light source right here is going through a diffuser or softbox, which is making the light source a larger light source because the light's coming from a lot of different directions instead of a small, tiny direction. And so we get this really soft, appealing shadow shape on her face. And this one right here, we have a naked bulb, right? So it's a smaller light source, right? Same distance. And so we're getting much sharper, harder shadows on our face. And here's the same concept. We have the same light source, but from different directions. So right here, when it's close up, those shadows are a lot softer. We can look at the shadows on her nose, for instance, like the cast shadow right here. And when it's farther away, you can see those shadows are much crisper, a lot darker, and a lot more contrast to it. And so what's going on here, I don't want to get into the specifics of this for the sake of this lecture, but mostly what's happening is that when you have a really small light source, any point where that shadow is either, or generally speaking, when you look at a surface where you're casting shadow on, you're either getting the light or you're getting the shadow, right, from that light source. And if you're using a point light source, whereas theoretically the light came from a single point in space and not from a surface or an area, then it's either on or off. Either you have shadows or you have light source on that surface, and there's no in between, and you get a really sharp fall off between them. In reality, most light sources are emitting light from an area, right? You're not emitting it from a single point in space. And so when I look at this spot right here can see every single part of the light source, right? So it's going to be fully lit. This spot right in here can't see, like let's say right here, isn't going to see any part of the light source, so it's fully in shadow and not getting lit at all. But this transition area between those two areas is seeing part of the light, so it's getting partially lit. And so this penumbra, this area between the deep shadow and the lit side, is going to be that transition where you're having portions of the light source hitting that area, and so you get a transition or fall off. So that soft shadow, that soft effect on from a soft shadow right here is going to be where you have a large enough light source where this part right here might be fully in shadow, like not getting seen at all by the light source, but this part right here is seeing part of the light source, not all of it, but part of it, and so you're getting a transition into the fully lit area. Okay, let's talk about some common lighting setup terms. So high key is going to be a lighting setup where most of your scene is well lit, and so you have a strong key lighting source and you're also getting a lot of fill or ambient light, and not a whole lot of your scene is going into shadow. So this creates a very safe, neutral, upbeat, pleasant kind of situation, right? So most shots in your film, unless you want it to feel dramatic or moody, are going to have a pretty high key setup, right? Most things are going to be fairly well lit. You still have shadows, right? You still have dark values, right? But for the most part, your scene is easy to see, easy to read. Nothing is being hidden away from you. Very common in most comedies, right? And any neutral shots that you don't want to feel like it's dark or moody. So this is from Moonrise Kingdom, right? And so these kids, that whole movie, a lot of Wes Anderson movies, because they're comedies or they're dramedies, there's going to have very high key lighting setups. And so it's just a lot of light everywhere. It doesn't have to be a funny scene, right? Or I guess this could be funny depending on who you are. But it doesn't have to be pleasant. In this case, they're using the high key, even lighting setup to make it kind of flat and boring because Bob's job is boring. He's in an office. And so that, that fluorescent lighting is making everything flat and gray like, a bland piece of paper, which is how he feels about his job. Low-key lighting setup is where you're going to have a really strong contrast between your primary lighting source and your shadow areas, which means that your shadow areas, or a lot of your image, is going to go to darkness. So in all these examples here, you can see most of the scene goes into darkness and adds a lot of drama to the scene. And because when we can't see things, we naturally feel a little uneasy or curious. And so it adds a lot of mystery to the scene, or makes something a little bit more sinister or a little bit scary. So you can see from these examples, we have really strong contrast between our lit side and our shadow sides of these areas. And so all that shadow adds drama or danger or interest or mystery to the shot. Here's an example from Clockwork Orange. Very bright scene, right? Really, really strong, intense, blown out lighting source. But a lot of the film or shot goes into shadow, especially the important stuff, right? We can't even see the characters' faces. This guy right here is just a pure silhouette. So we naturally look at these guys and we think, oh, these guys are dangerous, or oh, this is spooky, right? If we saw their faces and they were being lit from the front, they wouldn't be quite as spooky or scary. We mentioned earlier, but this is just going to reiterate, hard lighting and soft lighting. So a hard lighting setup would be similar to low-key lighting, where you're trying to create a drama or tension into the scene. And so your shadows are sharp, harder, and usually have more contrast between the light and shadow side. And that usually means the shadows are a little bit darker. Not always the case, but hard lighting is going to have this harder look to it. It makes things more dramatic. Soft lighting, on the other hand, is going to be more evenly lit, and it's going to have a softer transition from the light side to the shadow side, and it creates things that are safer or more appealing or more naturalistic. Three-point lighting is a very common lighting setup. So we're not going to go into all the different types of lighting setups, but this is one that is very popular for lighting characters. And it's not always just 3 lights. I think most of the time I wouldn't do just 3 lights, but it's using 3 of the different types of lights that we described earlier to create or shape our character in a very appealing way. And that's using a key light, so our primary lighting source, which is going to sculpt our form. And you can see this is the key light right here, right? So it's off to the side, it's not coming straight from the camera. It has this really nice shaping and sculpting to the form. And so this is our key light. The fill light is going to be that light that's balancing out or softening the shadow areas a little bit. So adding a little extra light into the shadow areas so that they're not as intense and dramatic, and we don't have such a hard, sharp contrast between the light and shadow sides. And then we have that rim or backlight that is coming in from the backside that's going to help with a little bit with the shaping, help separate the figure from the background, right? You can see in this example right here, a lot of those oranges, I think they are, disappear in the shadow side, and you can't even see this right here, and there's actually another orange right here that you can barely see, and so that rim light's helping a little bit with that contrast, or that separation from the background. Also adds a little extra shaping, right? Adds a little extra dimensionality to them, makes them feel a little bit more spherical, and it also just adds a lot of interest and appeal to it, right? And often, this is something I haven't mentioned, but rim light is often put in, mostly because it's in the shadow side, but also just to help with shaping, it's often put in the opposite side of the key light. And so it just kind of helps separate it a little bit. So here's your subject. You have your key light, you have your fill light, and I put the backlight right here. This person put the backlight right here, but it could be on the other side as well. But that backlight's just behind the subject. So here's some examples. So again, another example from Schindler's List. You have your key light source right here, the primary shaping of your figure, primary illumination source. You have a little bit of a fill that's coming in here, very dark on probably the screen that you guys are watching. And then the rim light to help separate from the background. We have a rim light right here, or a backlight that's kind of filling in the hair a little bit on the coat. We just add, again, it's kind of like that moonlight example. If we didn't have that, this whole part of his head would just be a black blob. And so it adds a little bit of extra information, a little bit of extra sculpting, and also separates him from the background a little bit. Here's a great example of a believability situation, so believability over realism. So our key light is this fire right here, but then we also have this really, really strong rim light that's coming from the moon. But you'll see, like on these characters, like the rim light's coming from the left, but it's also kind of coming from the right on these characters. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless there's like 3 moons or 2 moons in this setup. And so in this case, again, like you don't think about when you first see this shot, and it's all about believability rather than realism. When you're as a viewer, you don't really question it that much that is there multiple moons? How's that going to work? You just get a sense that, okay, there's light coming up. It's from the sky or from the moon. Okay, that I get it, I understand it. But we have this primary key light source, right? The main sculpting light source. That rim is really helping because without that, that would just be a shadow that blends in with the background. So it's helping sculpting bring out some forms, show some volume on these characters, right? You can see especially on this dad dinosaur, right? That rim light is really helping with the sculpting of his face. And then we also have this kind of foreground fill because between the key light and the rim light, this would just all be kind of a shadow. And so there's a little bit of a frontal light that's kind of softening these areas right here. Here's a classic just character lighting. You got your key, you got your fill, kind of filling in the shadow areas, and you got this rim light just kind of add a little extra bit dimensionality to the character. Very subtle in this case, but you can see that really soft kind of sharp blue on the his shoulders and a little bit on his hair. Here's another example, right? Key light coming from the side, a little dark fill, right? We're adding a little bit more drama to the scene, so we're not giving too much fill, so it makes it a little bit more moody and sad. And then we have this really strong rim that helps bring out her cheek and her jaw, because otherwise, again, that whole face would just be lost, that whole side of her face. Here's another Toy Story example, right? We have this key light, which is this bounce light that's kind of coming down from down here up into his face, which is creating the primary lighting source in the scene. We have some rim lights coming from the back that are kind of shaping him right here and right here, ostensibly from this window, right? Again, it really wouldn't make that much sense. So you would probably, in reality, you're lighting with light sources that aren't actually coming from the window, but more like right here and right here, just to get that shaping right and nice. But the motivation of it is that it's coming from this curtain behind us. And we have this, of course, fill that's filling on the shadow area because it's not supposed to be a dramatic moment too much, right? It's supposed to be kind of uplifting or motivational. So let's talk about becoming a good lighter. The first thing I want to say that I don't think I have a slide for is become a photographer. Go out, take photos. This should be something that you want to do as a hobby. If you're going to be a lighter, overwhelmingly, you should be a photographer as well, or somebody who takes photos and is interested in looking at light in real life. So all the lighters that I know are people who also love to do either photography or painting, right? Because they're studying from life, they're looking at stuff in real life. So study from life. If you're going to be looking at, or if you're going to be trying to make something feel naturalistic, or if you want to make something feel like it's at dawn or is in this particular climate or at this particular time of day, you should look at real life and understand what's going on, right? What's the quality of the light at this time of day? What's the color of the light? What's my primary lighting source? How does light move around the space? How does it bounce around, right? Are shadows soft or harsh? So you can see in this example right here with this couch, right, where this might be something that if you were just, working with a red couch and you were doing a painting, for instance, you might, if you're just not working from actually like a reference, which would be crazy, you wouldn't understand or think that this, this surface right here, you see the light source hits it. It doesn't look very saturated red. It actually becomes like a cool white or almost blue as that light reflects off and bounces off, and we're seeing all this reflected light, and it's also kind of blowing out the camera a little bit. But then you see this really rich red that's bouncing off of it into the surroundings, right? It's almost like this part right here is way less saturated than the actual light that's spilling from it onto the wall. And if that key light or that strong sunlight wasn't hitting that top of that pillow right there, then there wouldn't be any of that spill light hitting up here, right? This would be pretty much just the wood color. So looking at reference, taking photographs of real life, going around and looking at light, if you can in real life, is really going to give you a lot of information about how light just works in real life. We want to keep in mind that our lighting is meant to tell a story. That's the primary purpose, is we're trying to help with the storytelling in our film. And we're doing that in 3 different ways that we mentioned before, right? We're telling a story with setting the mood, setting the location, setting the tone for our shots through color, direction, the softness or hardness of our lights, right? We're trying to add an emotional or context to our moment. We want to direct the eye in the composition, right? So using value and this idea of creating focal points with contrast and separating space. And we also want to use our light to shape and sculpt our subjects in an appealing way and in a way that's easy to read them or not easy to read them if that's the purpose of the shot. So all these shots, take for instance this shot from one of the Harry Potter movies with Ron, right? We have this moment, which I think it was with the Dementors, and so they're like, coming onto the train. It's supposed to be a spooky moment, and so you have this shot where Ron is looking at his hand on the window, or he's trying to look out the window, and it's like really cold, and so you have this blue, cold lighting that feels kind of, it feels cold, it feels dark, it feels a little sinister. We have this lighting that's also creating a lot of the shot in shadow, right? So we see his face, so we're directing the eye to his face, we're revealing what's important, which is, his emotional reaction to the moment. But then a lot of our shot goes to darkness, and again, like this color of the lighting, it's adding a lot of drama and moodiness to the shot, which makes it feel a little spooky. So keep in mind those 3 things is, you're trying to tell a story, you're trying to direct the eye in the frame, and you're trying to shape or sculpt your subject in an appealing way. I mentioned this earlier with the motivated lighting, but remember that believability is more important than accuracy. So lighting doesn't have to be physically accurate as long as things are read well and are believable. So lights should be motivated, but they don't have to be perfect. So this case from one of the Pixar shorts, I can't remember what it's called, but this tractor beam light, right, is used to give the sense that there's this really strong energy force that is like sucking the character through the window. It's like kind of like a stream of light that picks up the character and drags them along. In reality, like they'd have to put like a light source that's like stronger than the sun, right outside the window to do that, or they would have to and also this whole environment would have to be filled with like some kind of dust particles or atmosphere to get these really strong God ray shapes. But you don't question it, right? Because it makes sense. There's some kind of device outside that's sucking them up. We have a cultural understanding what abductions are supposed to look like. And then those God rays, right, are giving a lot of shape and directionality to it. This example from The Incredibles, we have the primary light source is these desk lights, right? And so they're kind of bouncing up, or they're hitting the light right here, they're bouncing up and hitting on him as well. Again, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. If one, we don't even get a sense that these 2 light sources are actually on. I can't even see them. You feel like it kind of blow out a little bit. Parts that they hit on the desk would blow out, like these papers right here would be much, much too bright, and these ones over here would be way darker, right? Because these are pretty small light sources. And these papers right here are much closer to that light source than these ones over here. But again, we don't question these things because it kind of makes sense. We understand the light's coming from this direction right here, from these light sources. It's motivated. Like as a viewer, we understand it enough that we're not going to question it. And they're really making all these decisions with the lights to just make the lighting more appealing and make the image read well. This is maybe for larger projects, but you should always be working. Well, you should always be working from color script. So a lighting key or color script, something that's going to tell you as the lighter what the artist or the directors were going for in that shot, right? You're not just inventing these things from scratch. On a larger project, you're working from something called a color script, which is showing how the lighting and the color changes across the movie. And so you're making sure that there is continuity between shots, so that each shot isn't just completely unique and dynamic and different, but also seeing how the lighting you're working on in one shot moves into another shot later on or contrasts against it. So you can see in this one, this feels much more early, calm, not quite as dynamic, but you see once we get these strong reds and more saturated colors towards the end, it's like a crescendo, and it's in that song Make a Man Out of You, right? And so that's as the song kind of gets more and more dramatic and intense and heroic is when those colors start punching and getting more intense. So that's what a color script is. But work from reference, right? Whether it's concept art, hopefully from your team, a lighting key showing what the lighting is supposed to actually look like. And you can make changes, and you should make changes and make improvements, but you shouldn't be working from nothing. This is really popular if you're really into using any type of digital painting programs like Photoshop or Procreate, right? Taking a render from your shot. So it's like it could have all the materials on it, it could have just grayscale, and doing a paint over, and you can just paint light to kind of explore some ideas without actually having to do a bunch of renders. And get away from your work. So make sure that you're making your work smaller, like take a screenshot of it, look at it from far away, blur out the image, squint your eyes. What you should be focusing on is you shouldn't be focusing on the details at first. You should be focusing on the overall lighting structure. Is everything reading well? Is contrast helping me? Am I able to see what's important? Am I focusing, or what's drawing my eye? Am I focusing on what I want to focus on in the shot? So you can see in this one on the right hand side, even blurred out, her head is probably the most interesting part of this due to contrast and color. This part, maybe her torso as well, which could be problematic, but for the most part, like this area right here isn't that interesting, very low contrast. This part over here is not very interesting either. And so we want to make sure that from a distance or on a broad scale that our lighting is working. So don't get bogged down too much in the details, and make sure your image is still working from a distance.